As I was playing Resident Evil 4 Remake, it brought to the surface a feeling I've had since playing the original release. And that feeling is that it's not really survival horror. Now, it's fairly obvious that the game is way more action orientated than the first three titles, but it's not just that. There's a lot of tweaks that change the whole classic Resident Evil experience, but before we can begin talking about these changes, we have to go right back to the start, the birth of survival horror. The term survival horror was first used by Capcom in 1996 for the release of the original Resident Evil. The term was then retroactively applied to earlier titles that helped build and define the subgenre, games like 1992's Alone in the Dark, and if anyone's played that, it's basically Resident Evil 0.5. And then there's Capcom's own Sweet Home that released on the NES and featured many ideas that would make their way into Resident Evil, perhaps most iconically the door loading screen. So what the hell actually constitutes as survival horror game anyway? Well, if we check out a good old wiki page, survival horror is a subgenre of horror games. Although combat can be used in part of the gameplay, the player is made to feel less in control than in typical action games, through limited ammunition or weapons, health, speed and vision, or through various obstructions of the player's interaction with the game mechanics. The player is also challenged to find items that unlock the path to new areas and solve puzzles to proceed in the game. Games make use of strong horror themes such as dark maze-like environments and unexpected attacks from enemies. Now, everyone is going to have their own ideas about what is and isn't survival horror, so your opinion about RE4 is most likely going to revolve around those ideas, and that's fine. I mean, some people might consider Luigi's Mansion survival horror because there's horror elements and you have to survive the ghosts. I don't know, I've never actually played the game, but I just wanted to make this video to get across all the shit that's in my head and my own reasonings as to why I don't think Resident Evil 4 is true classic survival horror. A great game for sure, but just not one that I would personally put in the same boat as the original titles. So since I don't think you'll find many arguments that RE1 isn't survival horror, after all, it's the game that helped codify the genre the most, it's probably the best game to compare against RE4, and when we start to do that, then we start to find two different games and experiences. So let's start with the maps.
Resident Evil.
In Resident Evil 1, you obviously start the game in the Spencer Mansion. You are placed in a central location and can go off in pretty much any direction you so choose. Backtracking is the name of the game, finding keys or objects that open up doors on the other side of the map. Learning the map layout, taking in details, and memorizing enemy locations is important to progressing. You're always trying to think one step ahead and what terrors might be behind that certain door that you just can't open yet. This type of map design is typical of survival horror and applies to both Resident Evil 2, 3, as well as other titles. This style of map design actually forces you to retread dangerous areas, make tactical decisions about what routes to take, and choices about whether to clear out enemies on said routes or save your ammo and dodge them instead, potentially risking a good chunk of health in the process. Resident Evil 4's maps are generally set out more like a typical action game with a traditional start and end point. You don't really need to learn the layout of the maps as backtracking and exploring is minimal. You basically move through the maps from one end to the other, with some exceptions of course. The village map, for example, loops around in a circle. And you get to revisit certain areas like the village square, but you progress through most of it pretty much like you would a standard action game. The only time any map felt a bit like survival horror to me was when you get access to the boat and can move around the lake in search of the busts that unlock the church key. The castle in this respect is a huge missed opportunity. It's a pretty linear location, with you progressing through much of it going from point A to B. Sure, you can head back down the trodden path at any time, but unless you want to pick up some missed treasure or complete a request, there's no real need to. And yeah, there are some more open sections contained within the castle map, like the maze for example, but I still wouldn't call it survival horror map design as a whole. Now imagine how amazing the castle would have been if it was set out like the Spencer Mansion or Resident Evil 2's police station instead, carefully exploring different routes as you wish, rather than being handheld down a single path. There was just something so special about exploring the mansion, police station, streets of Raccoon City, and I think a lot of that comes down to the design of the maps. Now on to the puzzles. Puzzles are a key aspect for survival horror games, and Resi 4 Remake actually took one criticism of the original release and improved it dramatically by adding to the puzzle situation. And I have to say, they're now some of the best in the series. However, the way the puzzles in RE4 tend to present themselves goes against some of the traits of survival horror. So the best example I can give is the lithographic stone tablet puzzle in the bindery. You come across a locked door. The room contains all the puzzle pieces. You pick them up, solve the puzzle and continue. The sword puzzle and power grid puzzles are similar in this way too, so why does this matter? Well, in RE1 and other survival horror games, puzzle solving is often tied into resource management and backtracking. You often have to bring a puzzle piece to a location at the expense of carrying ammo or other items, and of course at the risk of encountering or engaging with enemies. Now, it wouldn't be fair of me to say that none of Resident Evil 4's puzzles involve travelling around a bit. There's the church key puzzle, and another great exception is the lakeside hexagon puzzle that requires you to find and bring 3 pieces to solve. But even here, completing the puzzle isn't necessary for progression, and the pieces don't take up any slots in your inventory, meaning you don't really have to think about what you're carrying and why. Which brings us on nicely to resource management. Resource management plays a big part in survival horror games. By limiting the amount of items and weapons a player can carry, you force them to make decisions about what best to carry at each given time. It's a key aspect to make you feel less like you're reenacting scenes from Predator, and more like you're ill prepared to face the threats ahead. In RE4, the character's storage space is, let's say, generous, and that's without the size upgrades that can be purchased, and it's this very size that often negates the need for careful management. Quest items, treasures, or puzzle pieces don't take up any room in the inventory either, so I never really felt the need to travel light for any reason. And throw in the fact that the typewriter storage only holds weapons anyway, and your choices really only boil down to which 3 or 4 guns to carry at any given time. Max ammo, grenades, supplies and heals are with you at all times. The only management I was doing was spinning items around, trying to make them all fit neatly, like some bizarre Tetris minigame. Along with resource management, scarcity of said resources is perhaps one of the most defining elements that make up a survival horror game. We all know that feeling of reluctantly using your last shotgun shell to take out that pesky hunter is one of both joy and despair. Joy that the little fucker is finally dead, but despair because you've got nothing left for the other one that's round the corner. Scarce ammo and lack of heals up the tension, and it's not uncommon to complete some of these games with only a few pistol rounds left in your inventory and a new favourite swear word.
Fuck you too!
So my first playthrough on RE4 was on the hardcore difficulty, and besides say the first few sections of the game, I never really felt critically low on ammo. Now, to be fair, I didn't really feel excessively overstocked either, although at one point I did manage to scrounge up around 100 pistol ammos, which is pretty insane, but I never felt the compulsion to hold back on combat, resort to knife play, or just straight up leg it the fuck out of there, all common tactics in RE1. but I guess everyone's experience is going to be slightly different here, depending on what difficulty you play, what items you end up getting from crates, and of course, how good a shot you are. But whatever your own ammo experience, one weapon that definitely takes away from the survival horror feeling is the bolt launcher. It essentially offers you unlimited ammo and can be quite beastly once you throw a couple of upgrades at it. It's sort of like your get out of jail free card, allowing you to take on smaller threats or waves while you stock back up on other ammo. Now RE4 does have a professional mode which might be more stingy with weapon ammo, but I've not played through on that difficulty yet, and you do have to complete a run of the game first to unlock it, so it's not a feature that's baked into the game from the start. But if anyone watching has played the professional mode, I'd be interested to hear about the ammo situation in the comments. Back to hardcore mode though, and other items like resources and gunpowder seem to be about as prevalent as ammo. Not overly abundant, but I always seem to have enough at hand to create more of whatever ammo type I needed. Now heals on the plus side were a slightly different story, and here I did feel the remnants of the game's survival horror origins the most, and whilst I never actually ran out, I was reduced to a single healing item on 1 or 2 occasions. But again, I guess everyone's going to have a slightly different tale to tell, depending on the difficulty, how well you are playing, and whether or not you can be arsed with the knife parries. So we've covered the weapons, now let's talk about the folk you aim them at. At the start of the video I said it's obvious that the game is more action orientated. So here are some estimates of the total enemy counts in RE1 up to RE4. I used the website evilresource.com to estimate these numbers. Link in the description for anybody who wants to check out this cool website. RE1 has an average of 118 total enemies, RE2 has an average of around 150, which is surprising as I thought it would have more. RE3 has around 285, which can be higher or lower per playthrough due to the more randomised nature of that game. And by adding up all my enemies killed score for each chapter, RE4 comes in at a whopping 936 on a hardcore run. Now, I'm not saying that survival horror games can't have huge enemy counts, and I'll admit the numbers can at times be used to invoke some survival horror type feelings, mainly that of being overrun by jippos. But let's face it, the game more often than not feels like a shooting gallery, so much so that it actually includes one to boot. Typical survival horror games excel in making even one enemy a serious threat, and you'll generally be facing off against no more than 1 or 2 nasties at a time. RE4 is quite happy to literally throw wave after wave at you with its action-based combat system, and it's not just about the numbers, it's also in how you tend to tactically approach the enemies that differ between the two games. So in RE1, you know that if you kill an enemy, that enemy will be gone from that area for good. This is important because it forces you to size up each encounter and make decisions about whether or not it's worth it to take out certain enemies. In RE4, I was blasting whatever jippo even looked at me the wrong way without any qualms or worries about ammo. The game practically begs you to shoot these inbreds to hell, blow them to heaven, or even just teach them about basic biosafety precautions. There's also several areas where I wasn't sure if the enemies infinitely spawn or not. Turns out they don't, there's just a fucking shit ton of them. And in these situations, I was worried about my ammo. Careful stockpiles of military grade munitions going down the can in a forced conflict. Now RE1 and other similar games did have a few enemies, mostly bosses, that you had no other choice but to eliminate. But for the most part it was always pretty much your choice whether you pulled the trigger or not. And I'm going to go on a bit of a side nag here, but some of the enemy design is a bit inconsistent too. The creatures in the originals were explained in universe and came in 2 delicious flavours. either mutations of everyday humans or animals that were products of the leaked T-virus, or bioweapons developed in Umbrella's lab. Where did these backward fucks get giant mythical trolls from? Now don't get me wrong, the progression from shabby villagers to the monks to the knight in armour type enemies is really nice, and it gives the whole package a medieval sort of tone. But then you end up fighting Seth Brundle's extended family and what look like Joker gang wannabes from Batman Arkham City. What's scary is very subjective. I'm scared shitless of giant spiders, whereas you might be more scared of Capcom having you control Ashley for the rest of the game. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Resident Evil 4 isn't as scary as the original, but what I can talk to you about is the atmosphere and tone. If we look at Resident Evil 1, we see a consistent tone. It's just tense, solo exploration of a mysterious mansion and surrounding area. There's nothing that really deviates from this tone, like say a platforming section set on the ice planet of Hoth. Now, as I mentioned a few moments ago, RE4 starts off with a medieval-esque tone. Tense solo exploration of a mysterious castle and surrounding area, and there's nothing that really deviates from this tone. Except when you're auditioning for the next Indiana Jones movie. Literally firing cannons at giant trolls. Going all Metal Gear Solid on Sentry Gun Island, knocking off Wave Race 64. Anyone remember that one? Some people call this variety, I guess, which is fine. We all love a KFC variety meal at times, but sometimes you just want one thing done really fucking well. RE4 does drip in atmosphere. I've already mentioned the castle map's unsurvival horror type design, but at least it offers up some of the most tense and atmospheric moments of the game. The maze filled with shit your pants jumpy wolves, the Clive Barker reject in the dungeon, and Ashley versus the Knights That Say Knee. RE4 does not lack in atmosphere or tense scary moments, but it often fails to maintain suspense due to the more action-orientated nature, and the atmosphere it builds is often blown to shit. I mean, you literally fire a cannon at a door, and giant fucking armoured trolls. Honestly, between them and the flaming catapults, I felt like I was playing fucking Lord of the Rings. And it's not just the castle, something like this always seems to be cropping up, and just when the atmosphere starts to build again, like say the first time you approach the spooky as hell looking church, you're greeted by, "Hello mate, alright governor?"
Got some rare things on sale, stranger.
Which segues us nicely to the safe room and the save system. Once the bane of many a forgetful player, the save system has been updated so much that it's no longer even a system anymore. It just saves, constantly and obsessively in the background. Many times I thought I was making a nice tactical save just before a new area or bad feeling I got, when in fact the autosave put me in a more convenient spot closer to the action anyway. I appreciate that the game is trying to save you from frustration when you're coming up to a difficult part that you might have to repeat a few times, but it just reinforces the action type nature of the game, getting you right back into the thick of it with no delays or consequences. Why does this matter? Well, it's all tied back into resource management and the feeling of being unprepared for what lays ahead, two classic survival horror game traits. By limiting the amount of saves, they become a resource for you to use as you see fit. You might not choose to save or actually be unable to save for a while, thus adding much more tension to each and every enemy encounter. Now, the professional mode does disable the autosave feature, forcing you to actually use the typewriter, but it's not an option for your first playthrough, and you still have unlimited saves as far as I'm aware. RE1 safe rooms had almost a Dark Souls campfire quality to them, and when you heard that soothing music, oh my god, how safe did you feel from the horrors outside? In RE4, the safe rooms are often in open spaces on the map, with the vendor showing up in the most outlandish locations, fully immune to the last plagas. And this took me out of the experience a few times, as there are a few save locations where you could see enemies just waiting around in the background. And although we've already covered resource management, I just wanted to add that the RE1 safe room was also a place where you could collect or store a couple of emergency shotgun shells, combine that green herb with the red one that you've had stashed for a while, or just grab that puzzle piece that you now need. RE4 safe rooms in contrast serve to make you more powerful by way of new weapons, weapon upgrades and case charms. So what we've gone through so far are the biggest reasons why I don't consider RE4 to be survival horror. But there are still a handful of smaller changes left to quickly mention. A sense of isolation is what survival horror games are very well known for, and whilst you do occasionally meet up with other characters for a quick chin wag, cup of tea and a Jill sandwich, you spend the vast majority of the games all on your own. RE4 has you spending a significant amount of in-game time with other characters, and whilst Ashley the lazy bitch still doesn't chip in with the combat, she's still company nonetheless. Also, the little notes that pop up on objects are missing. Like in the original games, you could check out a painting on the wall and some text would pop up saying something like, "just an old oil painting." Yeah, it probably seems dumb to some people, but to me and perhaps others, it just added to the atmosphere and feeling of the locations. The vendor feels like a link to the outside world and again counters the sense of isolation, sort of like a Resident Evil version of Asda, where you can stock up on Jill sandwiches and shiny new guns. Smashing crates is a very video game thing to do, like Mario bopping brick boxes, and it ruins the atmosphere at times. For example, the first time in the village encourages you to be stealthy, yet it's all bash, boom, crash, wallop, and none of the enemies hear the racket that's going on. And while we're on the subject of stealth, I do have mixed feelings about its use in RE4, and also whether it constitutes as a survival horror mechanic in the first place. Sure, in RE1, a big part of the experience was slipping past that dumb zombie you didn't want to waste bullets on, but they were always aware of where you were and always in hot pursuit. Well, lukewarm pursuit anyway. Stealth sorta seems to go against the scarcity of resource mechanic, because if you have too good a system, you could constantly resort to it to save a few rounds here and there. Anyway, I don't want to go too deep here and I'm just going to start to wrap this up. A weird one is, I don't know why, but a lot of the times I actually forgot that I was playing as Leon Kennedy. It just felt more like controlling random action guy. I'm not really sure why this was. It might have been the knife fights with Krauser, but anyway. Finally, weapon upgrades. I would have preferred to actually found these around the map instead of the treasures, because I never actually felt like I found anything exciting or surprising by way of exploration. It was always just some gems or a fancy crown that you use at the Resident Evil Asda to buy more shit. A lot of the changes made to RE4 and its remake actually make for a less frustrating gaming experience. The tank controls are gone, there's no losing 3 hours of progression and a controller out the window because you forgot to save. And before its fans neg me and my video to YouTube hell, let me state again, it's a really great game. There are undeniably still some aspects of survival horror left in RE4, but as we've seen, in comparison to the original, there's a lot of changes, and in making these changes, I feel like Capcom lost a lot of the survival horror elements that made the first 3 games so unique. RE4 leans heavily into action-based combat, situations, and overall design, so much so that I'd probably just classify the game as action horror. You could even argue that RE4 is an evolution of survival horror, the same way a vegan might argue that a Beyond Burger is an evolution of a chicken burger. And yeah, sure, things change with time. But that doesn't mean the original finger-licking recipe isn't valid anymore, or that the new evolution is any better or worse, just different. And sometimes all you want is a dirty fat chicken burger that is a true survival horror game.